Late in the year 410 AD, news of a terrible, era-defining event reached the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. This news soon arrived to Bethlehem, the alleged birthplace of Jesus Christ. Here, St. Jerome, one of the great church fathers who only recently had finished his Vulgate edition of the Bible, one which would become the definitive version for centuries to come, was struck by the news. It was that Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the Roman Empire which had dominated most of the known world for half a millennium, had fallen to a barbarian army. As Jerome strikingly wrote not long afterwards, the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. It was the first time Rome had been sacked by a foreign power in 800 years, over 3 times longer than the United States has existed as a country. And there was one man responsible above all others for this apocalyptic event, Alaric the Goth. Before exploring the life of Alaric, we should look at the historical background, as it is not possible to fully appreciate how Alaric came to be in a position to sack the city of Rome in 410 without exploring the wider history of Rome in late antiquity. Rome, as we all know, was a great empire, one which grew from being a minor city-state in central Italy in the 4th century BC to conquering the entire Mediterranean world by the time of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus in the 1st century BC. It peaked in the 2nd century AD, when it controlled land from the Scottish lowlands in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south, and from the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the Syrian desert in the east. Yet from its peak in the 2nd century, the empire descended into crisis in the 3rd century. The reasons for this were multifaceted and included a fiscal crisis and a period of decades in which civil wars abounded. The greatest issue, though, after a certain period of time, was the penetration of the northern frontier by waves of Germanic and Asiatic peoples that the Romans deemed less civilized and categorized as barbarians. These included groups like the Franks, Alans, Sarmatians, Alemanni, Angles, Saxons, Burgundians, Vandals and Suebi, who had variously come towards Rome's borders, either from Scandinavia or further to the east along the Pontic-Caspian steppe, or even as far east as the Asian steppe between the Ural and Himalayan mountains. They were drawn by news of Rome's wealth and also climatic factors, as northern Asia experienced a particularly cold period. These barbarian migrations soon resulted in these groups penetrating through the Roman frontiers along the rivers Rhine and Danube, and either raiding Roman territory or even occupying Roman lands. The Romans, weakened by a century of disorder, soon began co-opting the barbarians by hiring them in large numbers to fight for them. This reduced the emergency situation during the long reign of Constantine the Great and his successors in the first half of the 4th century, but as new waves of barbarians kept arriving, the problem intensified again from the 360s onwards. One of the new groups were known as the Goths, a Germanic people who had possibly migrated south from Scandinavia to the northern shores of the Black Sea. It was in this environment that Alaric was born. What details we have of Alaric's early life come from texts written by later Roman and Byzantine historians. The Getica of the 6th century Byzantine writer Jordanes is particularly useful. He stated that Alaric was born on Puce Island at the mouth of the delta of the Danube River, in what is now Romania. He is believed to have been born sometime between 365 and 370. Here he grew up within a community of Goths, though there was significant interaction between the various barbarian peoples of the frontier by this time. Many of them had also adopted elements of the culture and customs of the Romans. One element of this included the conversion to Christianity, the new state religion of Rome since the time of Constantine, a half a century earlier. This included Alaric, who in later life professed himself to be a Christian. Indeed, some Christian writers subsequently argued that Alaric's actions against Rome were the wrath of God, who wanted to use the Christian Alaric to punish the pagans of Rome. In his youth in Romania, Alaric would have heard tales of the Battle of Adrianople in 378, when an army of Germanic and Asiatic tribes, primarily led by the Goths, heavily defeated a Roman army near Adrianople, not far from the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople. In the course of the clash, the Emperor Valens was killed, and Constantinople stood vulnerable to attack by the Goths, though in the end the new Emperor Theodosius managed to fight back and prevent the capital from falling. Nevertheless, these events demonstrated to young warriors amongst the Goths in the late 370s and into the 380s that Rome was far from invincible, and even its mightiest cities could possibly be taken. Alaric did not begin his career as an antagonist of Rome. Instead, he joined the many other Germanic and Asiatic warriors who were being employed by the Romans to fight off their brethren who were trying to break through the frontiers. The Goths were being employed in this way in large numbers by the 380s as Alaric came of age, agreements having been made between the emperors and the Gothic leaders after Adrianople that they would be allowed to settle in the Balkans in large numbers, in return for some amount of government and military service. Accordingly, Alaric spent much of the late 380s and well into the 390s as a Roman soldier, albeit not amongst the Roman legions, but instead as auxilia, the name applied to foreign-born units of troops fighting for Rome. It is an irony of history that the man who would conquer Rome was first trained and employed by Rome. By the early 390s, he was the commander of a large division of Gothic warriors in service to the Roman Emperor Theodosius. If there was a turning point for him when his allegiances changed, it was at the Battle of the Frigidus River in September 394. Here Theodosius defeated a challenger to his rule named Eugenius. Despite the victory, what would have struck leaders like Alaric at the end of the battle was that the field was strewn with tens of thousands of dead Goths who had fought for both sides. The Romans, it appeared, were now doing little more than trying to kill as many Goths and other Germanic tribespeople as possible through their deadly conflicts. With this realization, Alaric abandoned the service of Rome and struck out on his own. In the second half of the 390s, Alaric established himself as one of the foremost barbarian warlords anywhere in Europe. This was a period of chaos generally across the empire, as the death of the Emperor Theodosius early in 395, a strong ruler who had revitalized the empire after the disaster at Adrianople in 378, led to a final split of the empire. Henceforth there were two emperors, one ruling the western provinces from Rome and one ruling the eastern Mediterranean from Constantinople at modern-day Istanbul. Many of the rulers which emerged at Rome and Constantinople during this time were weak emperors, and in the west, a half-Roman, half-Vandal warlord by the name of Stilicho managed to establish himself as the de facto power for much of the late 390s and 400s. He and Alaric would become rivals for many years. Meanwhile, Alaric took advantage of the chaos to lead his armies south to plunder the rich cities of Greece in 396, sacking the city of Athens in the process. After his invasion of Greece, Alaric and his men returned north with their plunder and remained relatively quiet for several years. Around 399 they became active again, often being hired as mercenaries by the government in Constantinople to fight off invasions from the northwest by Stilicho's armies. Around 400, a pogrom of Goths in Constantinople occurred, exacerbating tensions between the Eastern Romans and Gothic commanders like Alaric. It was in this environment that the government in Constantinople began engaging in actions which indicated the degree to which the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire were now effectively two different states. This was seen through their encouragement of barbarian leaders, like Alaric, to head west and raid the Western Roman Empire. The West's problem, it was believed, would be the East's boon, as tens of thousands of barbarians would leave the Balkans to plunder Western Europe. Alaric probably knew he was being manipulated, yet at the same time the idea had its appeal, and in the spring of 402, his armies advanced around the Adriatic Sea and into Italy, raiding the peninsula for the first time. This first invasion of Italy proved unfruitful. Stilicho marched to meet Alaric and defeated him on several occasions near Verona and other cities in the north. With this, Alaric decided to withdraw back to the Balkans and waited there until a more propitious situation presented itself for a second attempt. Incidentally, this movement of Alaric's Goths westwards led to the development of two different groups of Goths. These are known to the historical record as the Visigoths, or Western Goths, and the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths. The Visigoths were the ones who began to move westwards under Alaric's rule in the 400s. In 406 and 407, a huge incursion of barbarian hordes across the Rhine frontier and into western Germania and Gaul occurred. This major emergency created a huge problem for Stilicho in the west, and he began sending all available military contingents northwards to fight off the invasion. It was the perfect opportunity for Alaric, who now gathered his forces in the Balkans and moved to invade Italy for the second time. In 407, he moved into the province of Noricum around modern-day Austria and effectively conquered the province. Then he sent a message to Rome demanding a huge ransom of 4,000 pounds of gold, or he would invade Italy with all his forces. It was a sign of how desperate the situation was that the Roman Senate agreed to the extortion. Meanwhile, Alaric did not withdraw from Noricum, instead establishing himself as ruler of the region. This drew the ire of Constantinople, which considered this one of their provinces. It left Alaric in a good position, ready to invade either Italy or the Balkans on short notice, and able to continue extorting money from both Rome and Constantinople to prevent him from doing so. When the Senate refused to continue paying these bribes, Alaric descended into Italy in 408 and attacked and sacked numerous cities, even half-heartedly laying siege to Rome itself before withdrawing back to Noricum. The threat had not passed, though, and that autumn the Western Roman Empire suffered a setback when Stilicho, an accomplished military commander and tactician, fell from power and was executed shortly afterwards. In 409, Alaric began a fresh campaign against the Western Roman Empire, even as its military emergency continued further north in Gaul and Germania, with the Vandals advancing all the way through Gaul that year, and then crossing the Pyrenees to attack Hispania, a region that previously avoided much of the devastation associated with the barbarian invasions. In this environment, Alaric was unimpeded in laying siege to Rome, a city of maybe 800,000 people by then, in the late autumn of 409. The siege would last on and off for over half a year. Perhaps one of the reasons why the Romans did not move to stop it was that by the early 5th century the capital of the Western Roman Empire had effectively been moved north to the city of Ravenna, from where the emperors and their ministers could deal with the border issues along the Rhine more effectively. Thus, Rome was left to Alaric. He returned there in person in the summer of 410 with the intention of finally claiming the city. It seems to have fallen through duplicity, with an agreement reached with some anonymous Judas that the Salarian Gate, one of the main gates through the Aurelian walls that protected the city, would be opened to the Goths. Hence did Alaric and some 30,000 of his men begin streaming into the city on the 24th of August 410. 3 days of looting, pillaging, and much else followed as the Eternal City fell to a foreign foe for the first time since a Celtic war party had sacked it all the way back in 390 BC, a time when Rome had been nothing more than a city-state controlling parts of central Italy. It was one of the most seismic events in the history of the ancient world. Alaric did not live long to enjoy the fruits of the sack of Rome. Once the city had been sacked, its riches plundered, and doubtlessly many people enslaved and carried off, the Goths left, and the Romans began rebuilding, both physically and psychologically. In the immediate aftermath of the victory, Alaric led his armies south. Southern Italy and Sicily in particular were one of the bread baskets of the Roman Empire for centuries, the grain produced here feeding many Romans. Borderline famine conditions were beginning to develop across the western provinces by that time, owing to the interruption to normal life brought about by the invasions, and Alaric wanted to head to Sicily to acquire grain and other foodstuffs for his armies. However, he seems to have been foiled in this goal as a storm badly damaged his ships off the coast of southern Italy before he crossed to Sicily, and so he and his men wintered in the Campania region. In the spring of 411 they began to head back north, but Alaric fell ill with a fever and died shortly afterwards at perhaps as little as 41 or 42 years of age. Legend has it he was buried in the riverbed of the Busento, a small tributary of the Crati River in southern Italy, his men having diverted the river for long enough to allow them to bury him there, along with his valuable grave goods, so many of which were doubtlessly taken from Rome the previous year. Things did not improve for the Romans, and in particular the Western Roman Empire, after Alaric died. The barbarian migrations continued unabated, no doubt emboldened by Alaric's actions, which had demonstrated how weak and vulnerable the Romans had become after centuries of seeming invincibility. The Romans knew it too. In 410, the same year Rome fell to Alaric, they sent word to Roman Britain that the legions were to strategically withdraw from the island back to Gaul, the first time the Romans had abandoned a province. Britain was soon overrun by the Angles and the Saxons. Others, such as the Goths, Vandals, Alans, Franks, Burgundians and Suebi, continued to rampage around the western provinces. These groups, though, were all eclipsed in due course by the Huns, a new Asiatic people who had migrated from the steppes of Asia and who in the 430s established an enormous confederacy of different barbarian groups that was centered around Hungary and Poland, but extended eastwards as far as the Caspian Sea. Under their leader, Attila the Hun, a ruler who became known as the Scourge of God to the Romans, and who eclipsed even Alaric as a desecrator of all things Roman, the Western Roman Empire began to crumble entirely. His death in 453 only provided a brief reprieve. Just 2 years later, the Vandals, who had crossed decades earlier to North Africa and conquered much of the provinces there, sailed across the Mediterranean from Tunis and sacked Rome yet again, leaving behind their name as a synonym for mindless destruction. Thereafter, the Western Roman Empire was reduced to little more than Italy as the Visigoths and Suebi took over Hispania and the Franks and Burgundians seized Gaul. Eventually, Italy was occupied permanently by the Ostrogoths and other groups, and in 476, the ruler of this confederacy, Odoacer, deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, bringing Rome's empire in the west to an end after 1,000 years. Alaric's sack of the city of Rome in 410 was very much the beginning of the end.